SECfans.com, stepping outside the SEC for a game again. We do this, we're getting to where we're doing this like one game a week because, one, the SEC is so down this year that there's only so many games we can talk about, and two, we're getting to the point where we're getting close to the playoffs and the end of the year sort of drama, and that actually impacts the SEC as well. So this game, obviously, Ohio State and Penn State, we touched on both of these teams last year a good bit because they had such good years down the stretch. This year is a lot of the same, where they've both got clean records. They both have coming into this game with a lot of momentum, a lot of hype, and we saw last week Penn State absolutely dominated Michigan, and we've seen one stubbing of the toe this year against Oklahoma with Ohio State, but everything else has been just boat race city. So we're going to get into the numbers with this one. We're going to talk about our computer model and what sort of results it showed, but we also want to give a little bit of baseline for both of these teams. So let's start with Penn State. We know what we got with Ohio State, and in a lot of ways we know what we got with Penn State as well, but let's talk about Penn State, namely first, this game over Michigan. What do we see in this 42-13 win that surprised you, and what did we see in this game that you kind of expected?
I didn't expect it to be quite so dominant in a lot of ways. I mean, Michigan, frankly, I don't know that Michigan is a great team, and I imagine neither one of these fan bases is going to be sad to hear somebody say that. Both of us have kind of seen that coming to a certain degree, right? I mean, they lose to Michigan State, 1-score win against Indiana. We talk a lot. When you play bad teams and you play them close, it's not a great sign. And when we say bad teams and playing them close, we include a Florida game where they didn't dominate, because Florida is also a really bad football team this year. And so I thought Penn State would probably win this game. Where I wasn't expecting was that Penn State would put up 42 points in the ball game. And to sort of give context to that, I mean, the most anybody scored on Michigan all season was 20 points the week prior at Indiana. And, they really, under Harbaugh, traditionally, they are a really sound defensive team. Now, they lost a ton of guys, right, defensively, and we knew that there might be issues. I think there's a real chance it may turn out that Michigan's just not a great defensive football team, but still, Penn State controlled this game. And I mean, really, it's hard to take anything negative from that when you are passing for 10.8 yards per attempt, and when Saquon Barkley has 7.2 yards per carry, it's 17.7 yards per reception. There are no flaws, and to a large degree, really, other than really kind of around halftime, Penn State really controlled this game. I felt like from start to finish, they had one, again, outside that one lull. They moved the ball consistently well, and we can talk about that to death. But I think the flip side to this, and I think it's a flip side to a lot of stuff this season, is that Penn State's defense is actually playing pretty darn well. And O'Korn is not a great quarterback, and Michigan has a lot of issues on offense. But they, again, outside one quarter, really completely shut them down. I think Penn State's pretty disruptive. They're big and they're physical. They do a pretty good job in the secondary. We'll get to the model in a minute, and this all plays out in the model as well when we start modeling all the statistics. I mean, Penn State is just a good all-around football team. They're not just a big play team that they were last year, I felt like, with at times a deficient defense that, like the Southern Cal game at the end of the year. They're much better all-around football team. They can do things in all four phases. And that really is very important when you can play, rush and pass offensively and defensively. That's what you need to be to compete at a high level. It's what they are. So if they can maintain that, then they're going to be really successful. But if they fall back and they struggle to run the ball the way they did against Indiana or Northwestern, then they're going to struggle down the stretch. But I feel like the Michigan game showed that was an aberration, and they're just a complete football team.
So I'm kind of torn on this because, and just kind of a trigger warning for you Big Ten fans, we're about to kind of bash your schedules a little bit, but if you want to revert back to any of the videos we've made in the last, few weeks, we've done the same for SEC schedules as well. We have this feeling, and it's pretty obvious at this point, that there's no parity really anymore in college football, and the conferences are all across the board down and bad, and you have elite talent at the top. You've got a couple of teams in every conference that are really good, and then the entire rest of the conference is almost trash. And that's why you're seeing more and more of these blowout wins. And we've seen it, I think it hit the Big Ten a little sooner than it hit the SEC, and we've seen this with like Ohio State just kind of killing everybody and then maybe struggling in the playoffs, or we saw some of that with Washington last year in the Pac-12. Well, it's come home to the SEC as well. So don't think that we're just killing y'all when we have some things to say about your schedule. We think the same thing's going on in the SEC too. So let's talk about that, though. How do we know if these teams are good or they're just considerably better than really bad teams? And I say that or ask that because, man, if you're looking at these schedules, there's just not a lot to chew on. And we think Michigan's a big win, but is it a big win, or has Michigan just not played anybody? And by the way, they also lost to Michigan State. And then I know this is a long kind of open-ended question, but two things. One, how do I know anything about these teams? And two, what does it say about these teams that they're taking care of business against weaker competition? So, they're playing bad teams, but they're blowing them out of the water.
It's an interesting question, and I think it's sort of a result of the super conferences that a lot of people want to say this move to 14, 16-team conferences is going to make big-time college football better. The reality you kind of have to step back and realize is when you make these conferences bigger, you do it by absorbing the teams that weren't good enough to be in your conference ahead of time. And in the SEC, at least right now, Texas A&M is a pretty good team, but we brought in Missouri, and in Missouri, outside a couple years early, the last few years they've been terrible, and right now they're just atrocious. And in the Big Ten, you guys brought in Maryland and Rutgers, and what you've essentially done is it's easy to say, well, you've got 2 wins on your schedule with Rutgers and Maryland, and that's sort of inflating schedules, but you haven't played them yet, et cetera, et cetera. Where I think it's missed is, yeah, but so do a lot of the other teams you've played. It's the Indianas and the Northwestern and the Iowas. They're all getting a lot of these teams have an extra win or two because they got to beat Rutgers and Maryland, and where normally, they'd play a bigger team, they don't get a chance to do that. And to bring in a discussion, and you can look back some of our old videos, we have this concept called we called it a bag of wins, but essentially you have to remember in your conference, if you've got a 14-team conference and you all play each other, and let's say you play 9 games between 14 teams, it's a fixed number of wins, right? It's 100, in that case, what is it? 136, yes, 136, no, excuse me, 126 total wins if you had 14 teams, you all played 9 times. So 126 wins get split up amongst all the teams. Well, if the teams at the bottom are really bad, that means all the wins go to the teams at the top. And when you add teams like Maryland and Rutgers, what you've done essentially is you've given 18 extra wins into the bag. Maryland and Rutgers don't get any of them, so every other team in the conference wins more games as a result. What's the flip side to that, and what's the downside? Well, the downside is you have less parity, and you have less good games, probably more importantly. One good example of that this year is, Wisconsin. Well, really, the past couple of years, I mean, Wisconsin's avoiding any, up until the Michigan game, they're not going to play a ranked opponent. And right now,
Michigan's not
there
ranked.
isn't a ranked. Yeah, right. Michigan's not ranked. Wisconsin will not play a ranked opponent this year in the regular season. In the Big Ten, you have a team that will play in the Big Ten and not play a ranked opponent. And how does that happen? Well, it happens because Ohio State or Penn State gets replaced by Maryland in the schedule. And the same, again, we're dealing with the same thing with the SEC, with Missouri. Is really created a lot of fool's gold with LSU and Auburn the past couple of years. The Pac-12 has dealt with it off and on. And, Colorado has at least gotten better, but for a while they were a cupcake. This sort of problem makes it really hard to compare teams. And I don't fault Penn State and Ohio State for this, because you've taken care of business to a large extent. And a lot of it has been out of conference, but even in conference. However, it makes us have to be way more nitpicky because, it's great you beat Northwestern 31-7. It's great you beat, Indiana 45-14. But like we said earlier, I'm going to really ding you for the fact that you rushed for 1.05 yards per carry against Indiana or 2.5 yards per carry against Northwestern. Those weren't good marks. And it may seem silly to ding someone in a 45-14 win, but the reality is the teams you want to beat if you want to be a national title contender are a heck of a lot better than Indiana. And if you struggle against Indiana, maybe you struggle against everybody else. And probably more importantly, that may be the best data point I've got, because right now Penn State, you haven't beaten and you haven't played any team that is currently ranked. And you'll play one against Ohio State and maybe two against Michigan State, and that's going to be it. And same sort of issue with Penn State, and I think, excuse me, with Ohio State. And so, I mean, that is what it is, and it's a problem across college football. It's a problem comparing teams across college football. And I think what we're going to see repeatedly is we're going to see teams get to the bowl games and playoffs, and with no predictability. It's not going to be like the Big Ten every year is the one that's down, or the SEC. But every year we're going to get to the playoffs, and you're going to have teams that get in there, and you're going to go, you know what? It turns out that Georgia and Alabama were just better than the trash in their conference, and that's why they went out. Or it turns out, last year, honestly, probably a lot of the Big Ten teams really weren't all that great, but they beat all the other bad teams in the Big Ten. They were still really good teams, but they weren't quite at the level that the undefeated teams they got paired up with were. And I think we're going to see that every year. It's a lot of variability in the bowl games, and it's really, really tough to evaluate these high level teams. That said, I think there are things we can take away. We already talked a lot about Penn State, but maybe we move on to this point, Ohio State.
Before we do that, I want to talk one more, because I think the scheduling thing is important. And when we talk about these super conferences, and everybody went to these, or at least you got the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, they've gone to these 9-game schedules. I think it's that much more important that you play somebody out of conference that matters. And Ohio State historically has done a phenomenal job of this. So you've got 9 conference games, and then they always play somebody really good out of conference. And yes, sometimes you schedule a team and they end up not being great, but it's not your fault. If you schedule a big name team and they suck, that's not your fault. Penn State hasn't done that. You have to go back to 2011, where they had the tail end of the home and home with Alabama, to find an out-of-conference schedule or an out-of-conference team that mattered. And it's littered with Syracuse's and Pitts. And this year they start out Akron, Pitt, Georgia State. And they've got this Pitt series through 2020. And then they pick up Virginia Tech. Credit for having Virginia Tech, but you've got a 9-10 year gap where our only data points that we're going to have, like you were saying, like if everybody in conference beats each other, we don't know if you're good or if you got a bunch of wins because somebody has to win those games. Washington this year, their best out-of-conference game was somebody Alabama played as a throwaway game, and that's Fresno State. The other 2 games were Rutgers and Montana. We don't know who Washington is at all other than the teams they're playing in conference. So credit to Ohio State here. I'm going to ding Penn State a little bit. I know Pitt was a decent team last year, but that was luck. I mean, you're scheduling Akron, Pitt, and Georgia State, and you want respect on a national level, and we do respect you. We think you're a great team, but you got to do better than that, because we have even fewer data points out of conference that matter through the regular season. If you want to be able to sustain a loss during the year and still make the playoffs, you got to play somebody out of conference. That's my rant. I'm over with it. Carry on.
Well, I will piggyback off that a little bit too. Ohio State, by playing Oklahoma in a 9-game conference schedule, ends up having to play a really tough schedule. 10 games against Power 5 teams, and the 10th game is really tough. And there's a lot of finger pointing at the SEC for how many cupcakes they play, and they do play a lot of cupcakes, frankly. And we can go back and forth on whether or not there's enough parity to warrant it. But the best teams in the SEC generally try to schedule a tough out-of-conference opponent. Alabama opened the season with Florida State, a little bit of a different team with DeAndre Francois. Still don't think Florida State's a great team, even with him. But what that at least lets us look at, and this isn't really anything that's good or bad for, say, Alabama, it's just us as independent observers. At least it gives us some data point to figure out, okay, well, Auburn wasn't quite as good as Clemson, but they really slowed down Clemson's
Georgia,
offense. Okay,
Notre
well,
Dame.
Alabama,
Yeah.
Georgia, Notre Dame, Alabama, Florida State. We can do something to compare these different conferences, and it's getting harder and harder because as these the conferences get larger, teams like Penn State aren't playing out of conference. We just have less data points. And the analogy I always use, it's like if you had two postcards of a mountain range, and one was the Himalayas, and one was let's say the Andes. If all you see is the peaks on each postcard, you can't tell that the Himalayas are taller than the Andes because you just see one mountain in one postcard where this mountain looks a lot taller than the other mountains in that postcard, and then another postcard where this mountain looks taller than the other mountains in that postcard. And you're just saying, okay, well, apparently this mountain in the Andes is a lot taller than the other mountains in the Andes, and this mountain in the Himalayas is a little bit taller. Well, I guess the mountain in the Andes is probably bigger than the one in the Himalayas, and that's really what we end up doing statistically because we have we see how you compare within your own conference, but we have no way of comparing your conference to another. It's why we like doing these out of conference games a lot, especially when you're dealing with we can do a good job statistically modeling Penn State and Ohio State because at least you guys are in the same conference. But when we get to the bowl season these days, and you guys play, teams in a different conference, the statistics are so unconnected that it's causing a lot of confusion. And I think honestly, it's kind of a shame because it's our whole ranking system is a little bit skewed, and I don't know how meaningful a lot of it is.
You can say y'all. You don't have to say you guys just because we're covering a couple of Yankee teams. You can actually say y'all. It's okay. Anyway, Penn State, y'all, don't get frustrated. We're not saying you're a bad team at all. I actually think you're an excellent team. What we're saying is it's a little frustrating, and when we run these data models, it's a little harder because you play these cupcakes out of conference. There's no external data points to know how to compare, and that's all we're saying. So I think it's a decent segue into the computer model and the numbers. So before you give us what the computer model says, since we have, obviously some new viewers this time, let's go 2 minutes on what the model does and how you run it. And then, man, just dive right into the numbers.
So we designed this model to be a good estimator of what a B plus game looks like when team A plays team B. So we use all historical data. There's no man-made constants. We really try to eliminate subjective elements from this and just look at how each team does on a per play basis. We don't use total yardage because it's so driven by scheme and it tends to be very situational. It's not a very good comparative metric. From a per play basis, how good were your opponents? What was the standard, the bars you needed to hit to be effective against your opponents? Then we look at your production versus your opponent's strength. Calculate a lot of intermediate statistics off that. And one of the intermediate statistics we tend to talk about a lot is percentages allowed. So we'll talk about how each team did. It's easy to say, for example, that Penn State holds teams to 2.99 yards per carry. But how does that actually compare to what their opponents actually average? And so when we calculate it from that, a percentage of what percentage of opponent averages are you allowing? Not just how many yards per carry do you allow, but are you holding teams below their average or above? And then once we have all those numbers, we use that to generate a score prediction. And the score prediction works by looking at your historical data and basically charting it and saying, hey, when you had this much yardage, you had this many points. When you had this much yardage, you had this many points. Basically, not just linearly calculating a single formula for like points per play, but actually we do this with a more sophisticated, like normal curves, to actually sort of chart. Like if you get a lot of teams, if you have say 6 yards per carry, you might score 25 points. And if you jump to 8 yards per, if you had 6 yards per play, you might score 25 points. If you had eight yards per play, all of a sudden you score 50. It tends to increase exponentially. And there's also generally a point, especially if you get below 4 yards per play, where things completely shut down. So one of the things our model is tended to be very successful with is predicting blowouts, because we have a pretty good track record of predicting when you're going to be so successful that you score every drive, and when a team is going to fall below a certain threshold where their offense just doesn't function. And I guess last week we were, I think, 4-0 against the spread. Don't know if that'll maintain, but we have a pretty good track record with this. There's your 2-minute explanation. All right, getting into the numbers. I think the first thing to note here is both these defenses are pretty good, but I think the numbers show some interesting sort of strengths and weaknesses that maybe a lot of people don't fully appreciate. Obviously, Ohio State is really good against the run. They're holding teams to 64% of opponent rush averages. And I think people consider Penn State to be really good against the run because they're holding teams to about the same yard per carry average, 2.99, but it's only 86% of opponent rush averages. Now, anything from 85 to 90 we consider to be very good, and if you drop below 85, especially if you drop below 80, you tend to be in the elite range. You generally a good defense will be somewhere between 90 and 95%. That means you're serviceably good, maybe above average, Power 5, not really anything special. 86% means that Penn State is pretty good. Now, why is that pretty good and not elite, even at 2.99 yards per carry? The issue is Ohio State's opponents average a full yard per carry more than Penn State. Penn State's average, opponent averages, there's only one team on their schedule, and that was Michigan, that averaged 4 yards per carry. The majority of their opponents averaged less than 4 yards per carry. This season in general, we're tracking that teams are doing a little bit worse for the most part in rush averages. I don't really know why that is, but if you want to sort of plot it, and we'll do this for a couple different things because there's so many interesting statistics here. The average, the average opponent for Penn State in rush averages is about 3.5 yards per carry. That's Buffalo. Essentially, your average rushing opponent is Buffalo this year. And that's, again, not me subjectively saying that. I'm saying statistically, that's the average rush attack you've been facing, because most of the teams you faced just really struggled. Again, it's been a week early schedule. Michigan was the best of them. So now let's flip to the other side and talk about pass defense. Ohio State is averaging or only allowing 93% of opponent pass averages. Penn State is 76%. 93% is okay. It's not great. And I think a lot of Ohio State fans aren't shocked by that from early in the season, but I think maybe where there's a little bit of confusion is the idea that Ohio State's gotten a lot better later in the year. You have to realize how bad the last 5 opponents have been in pass statistics. Army averages 4.9 yards per attempt. Rutgers averages 4.9 yards per attempt. Those are 2 of the worst 4 passing teams in the country. In fact, if you really take out that Oklahoma statistic and you look at just the remaining games, the average passing game from their other opponents outside Oklahoma is only 5.9 yards per attempt. 5.9 yards per attempt is really, really bad. Again, try to give you some context for that. If you were to find a team with 5.9 yards per attempt, that's going to be probably the closest is 116th Mississippi State, somewhere around Oregon State, 114th. Basically, your average, outside that one Oklahoma game that Ohio State lost, their average opponent in terms of a passing attack is about 115th in the country. So both these teams, when we sort of ragged on your schedule, this was why we brought that up, because when we ran this model, your average opponents in key areas are really bad. Now, you've done pretty well. Like, Penn State, 85% of opponent averages is pretty good. And when your opponent average is that low, by the way, it's hard to really impress. Alabama had the same problem early in the year in our model. They didn't look all that great as a rush defense because their opponents were so bad it was hard to distinguish themselves. But the problem is when we're trying to model it's really hard to be effective because we don't really know where you stand because you haven't had really a whole lot to beat. Penn State, I think this is probably an underrated aspect, is they're actually doing really, really well against the pass. They're only allowing 5.2 yards per attempt. It's 76% of opponent passing averages. So what you've got here is you have an Ohio State rush defense that's really good. You have a Penn State pass defense that's really good. And then you have a Penn State and Ohio State rush defense and pass defense, respectively, that are good but aren't really elite and probably not quite as good statistically as a lot of people think. Now, why is that interesting? Well, the interesting thing here is Ohio State is a run-first team. Penn State is an explosive passing team with McSorley. And those are the 2 question marks for both respective teams. Penn State a little bit better against the run than Ohio State against the pass. But There's a lot of signs here that both teams have significant weaknesses defensively, or I won't say even necessarily significant weaknesses, but they have areas of concern right where the other team has proficiency offensively. So the model, to take it a step further, kind of sees that, and it flags this as a game that's probably be a little bit more high scoring. It's expecting Ohio State to have about 5.9 yards per play, Penn State to have about 5.5 yards per play. But Penn State should be able to get about 8 yards per attempt according to the model here. And that's where all this stuff sort of shakes out, and it feels like Penn State should be favored. It has Penn State 33, Ohio State 31, and the reason for that really is Ohio State's pass defense is not good enough to shut down Penn State's passing game. Ohio State should still be able to run the ball at a high level, but probably not quite enough to keep up. That is what the, again, neutral, not influenced by me model says. And we can get into an interpretation of the model, which is a lot of what our show is, but that's about where you guys lie statistically. And so it comes up with a 33-31 Penn State win.
And what's also interesting about that is we look at Trace McSorley and Penn State as potentially having some success through the air, and we haven't even talked about Saquon Barkley yet much. I know you talked a little bit about him a couple of games ago, but we actually did a video I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, ranking the top 5. You gave your top 5, I gave my top 5 best running backs in the SEC, and then we compared that to where would Saquon Barkley fit among all these. So if y'all want to watch us talk a little bit more about him, just check out that video. But that's what I think is interesting about this is okay, yes, Ohio State might have some more success running the ball, but I don't think that they're going to be able to completely shut down Saquon Barkley. That's interesting to me, but I also look at, we don't get a whole lot into the human element and the psychological or non-chartable things, but if we look at the one game where Penn State struggled this year, it was on the road at Iowa. And look, I think that's a tough place to play. I think it's pretty obvious. It's a game environment. I mean, they really got up for this game, and I think it affected the outcome and made it closer than maybe it would have been. But I don't think Iowa's a great team. And Penn State gave up 8.2 yards per attempt, I think, in that game. Yes, there was one, I think, 70-yarder, but still, that shows me that there's potential there to not play well against a bad team. And what we tend to talk about when we do these matchups and these videos is, how do you play against poor competition? Do you handle your business? And how do you play against good competition? So we've seen on Ohio State's side, they played poorly, in my opinion, and probably everybody else's. They played poorly against an Oklahoma team that has shown to be not great, but we know they're good, and we know they can throw the ball. On the flip side, Penn State's playing, in my opinion, again, poorly against an Iowa team that's probably not great. In terms of talent, I think you and I both agree that Ohio State's got more frontline, maybe 1 or 2 deep, players on both sides of the ball. They're going to be more talented as a unit, as a whole. I don't think they've got a running back as talented as Barkley, and maybe not as good a passer as McSorley. But throughout this year, I think you've said that Ohio State is still one of those teams that scares you if you're talking about a matchup in the playoffs against an SEC team. So if we look at all this crap that I just said, and throw it all out and just say these two teams are playing each other and Ohio State is the team we're scared of in the playoffs, does that tend to have you gravitate towards an Ohio State win and disagreeing with the model, or are you more tracking with the model in this one?
I think I tend to track with the model a little bit, honestly, and I'll tell you why. The reason Ohio State is a scary matchup for SEC teams is because they're a really, really good run defense, and they're an active front, and their singular weakness, I think, is the fact that they aren't phenomenal in pass defense in actual like deep vertical passing games. I think the corners are a little bit weak. They don't play the ball well in the air. And I don't think there's any SEC team that could make the playoff that can exploit it. Alabama is not an elite passing game. They've improved from last year, but they're still not elite. We both have serious concerns. We go back and forth a lot with a lot of Georgia fans with Fromm, who hasn't really, maybe is an elite passer, but really hasn't shown it yet. Penn State isn't that team. Penn State is not built like an SEC team. They are built more like Oklahoma. And there's a lot of similarities to me between McSorley and Baker Mayfield. And the thing Ohio State doesn't want to face is a team that's going to have a scrambling quarterback that extends a play and can kind of neutralize that elite pass rush. I mean, elite. It's a weird double-sided coin every time you talk about a really active front, because to a certain extent it's what you need to deal with a mobile quarterback. But also to a certain extent, mobile quarterbacks are the things that can neutralize it because they can move outside the pocket. So Penn State can move the ball, to a different launch angle, get it outside the pocket and away from the Bosas that Ohio State has, launch the ball downfield and throw it at somebody like a Sheffield that hasn't shown he's able to play the ball in the air very well. And as much as I think Ohio State would be a really rough matchup for somebody like Alabama because they are so stout in the front seven, I also tend to agree with the model. I think Ohio State is going to have a tough time keeping pace because it goes back to it. I am not impressed with the strength of the passing games they've played in the past few weeks. And while they've looked a lot sharper, I'm not really sold that the teams they've played have been able to, do anything to show whether or not the secondary's improved. So my only data points are the first few games in the year. And they struggled. So I have to assume, absent some better data point, that they will struggle in this game, and maybe they will prove me wrong. But just objectively looking at the information we have in front of us, that's where I lie.
All right, so give me your gut score since you're tracking with the model. Give me your, if you're going to put a number to it, what do you got?
If I were to give my gut score, I'm thinking probably I'll go 42-34 Penn State. I think this could be a really high scoring game. I'm a little nervous, honestly, about Ohio State's offense. They've seemed very sputtery. We've had long discussions about this in regard to SEC teams because, going back, Meyer had this at Florida, scheme at Florida. They've adapted it quite a bit with Barrett. But that horizontal spread attack is really disproportionately effective depending on strength of opponent defenses. That attack tends to be a little bit of fool's gold. Right now we're seeing it with Auburn in the SEC where they blow out team after team when they play average to bad defenses, and when they play a good defense, they would completely curl into a ball. Lane Kiffin's Alabama offense had the same problem, and Ohio State fans saw that firsthand, that when that 2014 Alabama offense was record-setting because it was this horizontal spread, lots of receiver screens, lots of bootlegs and drag routes, and it was all about trying to exploit space from the perimeter. But once a defense was actually fast enough to cover those plays and could play downhill, suddenly that offense completely and totally would shut down. And I fear that Ohio State is running a similar offense right now under Meyer. It certainly seemed that way in the playoff last year. So that's kind of my red flag, but I'm going to stick with 42-34. However, I think it's way more likely this actually becomes a Penn State blowout than Ohio State blowout, simply because I think the one real critical point that could be a big point of failure is Ohio State's offense. I mean, that's accepting the fact that Ohio State could really, if they disrupted Penn State's passing game on a regular basis, that could have a huge effect too, but I think that's a lot less likely.
I don't think it's going to be that high scoring. I think both of these teams are going to play a little tight, knowing that this is probably, I know this is ridiculous to say because Wisconsin's still out there. But like we both talked about, Wisconsin's going to be a division winner without a ranked win. And we've seen this happen before. We've seen it play out before. I think it was 2014 where they came rolling in there without having played anybody and got just worked. And I think this is a better Wisconsin team than that, but I still think this is potentially a play-in game to the playoffs. I think Michigan is done. I don't think they're going to give Ohio State any kind of pressure at the end of the year, so I could see this being that. So I think both teams are going to play a little tight. Give me 27-24 Ohio State. This is ridiculous. I always stick with the data. I don't always stick with the data, but almost always stick with the data. I feel like right now there is a lot of we don't know what we don't know about both these teams, but I think more so with Penn State. And I also know that Ohio State has a tendency to roll an egg out there once a year and completely recover and completely put it out of their mind and play, just blow people out just all the way through. So I think they're a better team. I would not be surprised at all if Penn State won this game. I would be surprised if either team blew it out. 27-24 Ohio State is my score. You're probably rolling your eyes a little bit, but it's not on camera, so you can't see that I'm deviating from the numbers. But we've done this a little bit this year. I want to do it some more. If Penn State wins this game, give me the MVP. And if Ohio State wins this game, give me the MVP.
I think if Penn State wins the game, the MVP is, in my opinion, almost certainly going to be McSorley. Everybody's really high on Barkley. We're really high on Barkley. You can watch that video and you'll find that out. We've drawn a lot of heat from SEC fans for that. But this isn't a game, I think, that Barkley's going to be able to take over. Ohio State is one of the best run defenses in the country. And there's no bones about it. There are bigger weaknesses in the secondary, and maybe they overcompensate if Penn State has some success. But I think absolutely the way you win this game is by, really testing the Ohio State secondary, which means, that means McSorley has a big day, and maybe Barkley can make some plays in the passing game. But again, Ohio State's got a little too much athleticism at linebacker to exploit them the way they have some other opponents. On Ohio State's end, if Ohio State wins the game, they're going to win the game by, I think, controlling the line of scrimmage and running the football. And the guy right now that looks like the guy to do that is J.K. Dobbins. Incredibly impressive what he's been able to do as a freshman. And I think if they win the game, it's going to be because J.K. Dobbins is able to bludgeon them, and Ohio State's going to be able to build a lead and run away with it. And I think, as much as I think he'd be the MVP, I think it really end up being the defense. I think it's going to take, for Ohio State to win this game, they're going to have to get a lot of sacks, and they're going to have to get a tremendous amount of pressure. And, guys like Bosa are going to have to show up big time for this Ohio State defense. Maybe I'll actually take it back. I bet Nick Bosa is actually the MVP if Ohio State wins the game, because I think he's going to have to make some big plays to keep, again, that offense that McSorley runs, that vertical passing attack. It's a lot of shots that are low percentage plays. And if you get some sacks and you get some hurries where he has to throw the ball away, if on first down he throws a shot and he misses, and then on second down you get a sack, all of a sudden it's 3rd and 14. It's really easy to get them behind the sticks. So negative plays have a really huge impact. And yeah, I'm gonna go back on my word now. I think if Ohio State wins the game, it's actually going to be Bosa that's probably the MVP.
All right. So with that, you got anything else on this game of note or interest, or does that pretty much cover it?
It's about it for me.
Okay. Well, y'all, thanks so much for sticking with us this long. We wanted to give this game its due because there's, like we talked about with the lack of parity, there's so few games right now in college football that matter, that have this just gravitational pull, and we went a little long on this one because we felt it necessary to give this game its due because it may end up being a play-in game for the playoffs. So what we tell everybody, SEC fans are used to hearing this from us, but for y'all as well, please give us your score predictions in the comments below. Tell us what you think about it. Feel free to disagree with us. Give us a thumbs down if you didn't like the video, but tell us why. Back up your position with data. We'll engage you in the comments. We're not just going to leave them out there for you to talk trash without backing up your position. So we're going to give you some back and forth there. If you liked the video, give us a thumbs up. If you loved it, even though you think we're SEC homers, we're really not. We're just honest to the data. Give us a subscribe. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.